Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. So this week is our second interlude of the year as we head into the fall break. And what we'll be looking at in class and as far as homework goes is this larger picture of who may have quote unquote discovered the Americas before the Western Europeans got there. But for homework, while we're in class focusing on the possibility of Jung Ho getting to the New World, your homework will be focused on the possibility of two other people, the Vikings and the Polynesians. But before you look at the evidence that may suggest that they got to the Americas, let's learn a little bit more about their migrations. In the case of the Vikings, let's start off by pointing out they too are descendants of the Indo-Europeans. In fact, they may have been closely related to the Germanic peoples that began migrating in the classical period, if you recall. Their homeland is the area that we now call Scandinavia. And the reasons for their migration appear to be based on population pressure and food shortage. As you will see, they are mostly subsistence farmers, small-time pastoralists, a lot of hunting and fishing. And as their population grows, that's putting pressure on them to move to new places. But there's also a cultural aspect to this insofar as Vikings as a culture uh, raid other people and take their treasure. Their political system, a warrior chiefdom, the chiefdom gets his support by spreading the wealth that they have looted from other people. And so there's an aspect of the Viking migrations where it just seems they are built to move around a great deal. Now, they happen to have a clearly superior naval technology and knowledge. Their shipbuilding techniques include these boats, the longboats. And the thing about the longboats is they're great for long voyages over open oceans, but they are also, if you notice, a flat bottom boat that is very easily used in rivers. Their knowledge of winds and currents also vastly superior to many of the other people around them. And as they're migrating, their purpose initially was not to find places to settle. Instead, they would go on raiding parties. And in this sense, they're sort of like the Mongols were in the first place, where they're just going out and attacking people to take their stuff. So they do this like, once or twice a year, plan these raiding parties, go, take everything, come back, but they were not constantly looking for territory to move to, at least initially. They used the river systems throughout Europe to do this. In both Eastern and Western Europe, those longboats are able to go from the ocean into inland areas, and then they can, move on to land and start moving around and raiding villages all over Europe in that particular way. And this happened for about 300 years, slightly longer, depending on what exactly area you're looking at. But it's a time where it's really terrorizing Europe. If you look at this particular map, you'll notice there's essentially three different waves of migration. In this map in red, the Swedes, who are the ones that move into the area that will become the Kievan Rus. If you remember, they establish a trading city, Novgorod, and then eventually move down the rivers, set up Kiev. And here in the yellow, the Danes, who are moving along the coastline throughout Western Europe, looking for rivers and bays and places they can move in to raid Western European territories. And then in white, you have the Norse, who will occupy a great deal of territory in Scotland and Ireland. But what they're most noted for is their movement west. They will be the ones who build settlements first in Iceland and then Greenland, and then, as we'll see, potentially even all the way to North America. Now, in the case of the Polynesians, their situation, they're descendants from these original people called Austronesians, who we think their homeland tens of thousands of years ago may have been the island that is now known as Taiwan. But they're part of these people that had been slowly moving further out into the Pacific until eventually it appears that political reasons are primarily behind their migrations in this particular time period. Specifically, conflict over chiefs and the sons of chiefs over who should be in charge, it appears is leading to pressure for people to go out and find new territory to become the leaders of as a way to avoid constant warfare within their own society. Like the Vikings, however, they clearly have some maritime superiority. Their ship designs including something called an outrigger, which if you look on this image off to the right, the outrigger is the part that adds stability, particularly in the open ocean. Sometimes you'll see the outriggers on both sides of the canoe. They also have a technology, though, for making their boats using planks of wood that are sewn together in a particular way. This will be a key piece of evidence, as we'll see, in the proposition that the Polynesians actually made it all the way to the Americas. And like the Vikings, they have a very familiar knowledge with the wind and the currents in the South Pacific. And so they're able to capitalize upon that knowledge. Significant difference, though, is in the case of the Polynesians, the islands that they go to are completely unpopulated. In fact, you could argue they're like the very last wave of human migration out of Africa. Because as they're moving to all these smaller islands throughout the South Pacific, there have never been any people there, and they're the first ones there. Unlike what happened in the past, though, they are bringing with them domesticated plants and animals because they are obviously doing this well after the Neolithic Revolution. Like the Vikings migrations, the Polynesian migrations last for about 300 years, but you'll notice that they're a little bit later than the Viking migrations. The area that they move into in the Pacific, first of all, notice here's where the Austronesian original homeland was, and this was probably 10,000 years ago or somewhere around there. But you can see they're slowly moving into different parts of the Pacific Ocean. But this area, this triangle between New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island, it's frequently called the Polynesian Triangle. If you look within there, that's the area that is colonized and where the migrations during this time period happen. Almost all of them sometime between 1000 and 1000 and 1300 of the Common Era. In terms of effects, for the Vikings, the effects are pretty significant. Their raiding and constantly pillaging is having negative consequences on the villages and towns, the churches and monasteries on the outer skirts of Europe where they're trying to spread Christianity. The threat of attack, that constant threat of attack, combined with the fact that there is no one strong centralized state, if you remember, is what leads to the development of feudalism in Western Europe. This idea of exchanging land for loyalty as a way to protect against the threat of invasion when there is no strong central state to provide such a protection. Later on, though, the Vikings will actually occupy and then rule significant territories in Western Europe, and eventually so much so that they become assimilated into European civilization. They convert to Christianity. They start taking up the writing practices that we associate with most civilized people. And so over time, they very much just sort of blend into the larger European civilization in which they are interacting. And then, of course, you'll remember in Eastern Europe, it's the Vikings who will form the Russians, the Kievan Rus. And if you remember, too, the word Rus, which means ruddy or red, is significant. In this map, what you see is the distribution of the frequency of red hair in Europe. The dark red areas are the places that have the most red hair. What they include on the right are the areas that would that were the Novgorod settlements by the Vikings, and in the British Isles, those were the places that were settled in what's now Scotland and Ireland. Finally, though, question we're going to look at in class: did the Vikings actually make it all the way to the Americas? We'll look at the evidence to support that and evaluate that later on, but that's a pretty significant question. In terms of the Polynesians, the effects there, first of all, they're establishing agricultural villages, as I mentioned, in these places that had no human beings before they got there. And the environmental consequences of that are pretty significant, because they're bringing with them domesticated plants and animals that are definitely transforming the environment. And in some places, as we'll see, they actually cut down all of the trees on the island, and none of the trees can grow back. And so they've literally dramatically changed the whole environment of the islands. They built strong chiefdom societies where the rulers of these chiefs will eventually start to become kings, in which they view themselves as divine or semi-divine. They adapted to new environments. For example, the Maori people in what is New Zealand, a very rugged, mountainous area that they will adapt to. In Easter Island, the Rapa Nui, these are the people that I mentioned before who, when they get there, the island is actually heavily forested and very quickly deforested. So the humans actually lead to their own destruction on the island of Rapa Nui. And then there's the question of if they got to the Americas as well. If they did, it's likely to have been after the Vikings. But again, this is evidence that we will look at more closely over the next couple of days. In this image, what you see is the winds and the currents that the Polynesians had a great deal of familiarity with. And if you know, quiet please, and if you notice that the winds are blowing from Hawaii towards the southern coast of California in pretty predictable ways. If you look at the bottom two, you will notice those are the sewn plank boats, the technology of which only the Polynesians had, and then somehow they end up in both North and South America. Finally, the spiced tea chart for the Vikings and the Polynesians. If you will take some time to look over this, you will see a great deal of similarity between the two, and the places where they are not similar are very significant differences. So I hope you were able to annotate the notes for the next couple of days. Your homework will be looking at the evidence for whether or not the Vikings and the Polynesians made it to the Americas before Christopher Columbus. Meanwhile, in class, we'll be looking at the evidence of whether or not Zheng He and his treasure fleet from Ming China actually made it to the Americas. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing you in class.